Okay, I want you to imagine something. Picture setting sail to go all the way around the world. Now, picture doing it back in 1895. No GPS, no support crew, no anything. And you're doing it in a boat that most people would have just written off as junk. Well, this isn't some adventure novel. This is the absolutely true story of one man's incredible, almost unbelievable journey, the very first solo circumnavigation of the globe.
And that's from the man himself, Captain Joshua Slocum. This quote, it just says it all, doesn't it? For Slocum, the sea wasn't some adversary to be beaten. It was his home. It was his element. He knew its rhythms, its moods, in a way that very few people ever have. And it's this deep, lifelong connection that gave him the quiet confidence to even think about attempting what everyone else thought was impossible.
I mean, really think about what this meant in 1895. There's no weather radar telling you a hurricane is coming. There's no satellite phone to call for help. If your mast snaps in a storm, you are utterly, completely, terrifyingly on your own in the middle of a vast ocean. So the idea of one single person in one tiny boat sailing around the entire planet, it wasn't just seen as ambitious. To the professional sailors of the day, it was considered a death wish. It was madness. So the question wasn't just could he do it, but how could he possibly survive? All right, so let's start this story where all great sea tales begin, with a man and his boat. And in this case, we're talking about a master captain who the world had kind of forgotten, and a boat that was, well, basically a piece of trash. So here he is, Captain Joshua Slocum. This guy was born in Nova Scotia, came from a long line of sailors. This wasn't some hobbyist. He had commanded the great sailing ships, the tall ships, all over the world, from China to Japan. But the world was changing. Steam power was taking over, and the age of sail was dying. Slocum suddenly found himself a man out of time, an old sea dog with no ship to command and nowhere to go, except, as it turns out, everywhere.
And this is just as important. His vessel, the Spray. This wasn't some state-of-the-art yacht. It was an old, beat-up oyster boat. It was literally rotting away in a field in Massachusetts. A friend gave it to him, probably as a bit of a joke, honestly. But for 13 months, Slocum took this wreck and piece by piece rebuilt it entirely himself. He went into the woods, felled an oak tree for the new keel, and replaced every single plank by hand. He transformed this forgotten heap into the ship that would become a legend.
And you can just imagine what the locals thought. This quote sums it up perfectly. After all that work, his neighbors would look at this strange, sturdy little boat and just kind of laugh. "It'll crawl," one of them shouted. They saw a clumsy little tub, not a vessel that could conquer the world's oceans. Oh, if they only knew. This timeline really puts the sheer scale of this thing into perspective. Just look at this. We're talking more than 3 years. He leaves Boston in 1895, sails all the way down the Atlantic through the infamous and deadly Strait of Magellan at the tip of South America, then across the entire unimaginably vast Pacific Ocean to Australia, and he's not even close to done. From there, it's across the Indian Ocean, around Africa, and all the way back up the Atlantic to come home in 1898. This is a monumental voyage for a full crew on a large ship, let alone for one single man. Now, the first real test of his journey wasn't a giant storm or a sea monster. It was something much, much harder to fight. You see, surviving the ocean is one thing, but surviving your own mind when you're completely alone, that's a whole different battle. That first long stretch across the Atlantic became a brutal war against an absolute, soul-crushing solitude. To keep from going completely insane in the silence, he started inventing his own reality. He was genuinely afraid he'd forget how to speak, so he would stand on deck and shout orders to an imaginary crew into the wind. At night, he'd look up at the moon and have long, formal conversations with it, as if it were an old friend. He'd sing sea shanties at the top of his lungs, and he wrote in his log that he thought the porpoises that swam alongside the boat really seemed to enjoy his singing. And then things got really bad. Off the Azores, he got his hands on some fresh plums and some local cheese, a real treat after so long at sea. But the combination made him violently ill. He was doubled up in agonizing pain, totally helpless with a fever and cramps. And it was at this exact moment, at his absolute weakest, that the sky went black and a ferocious storm slammed into the tiny Spray. So there's Slocum lying on the cabin floor, delirious with fever, and he looks up. And he sees a man standing at the helm of his boat. A tall sailor, looked kind of like a pirate, with a red cap.
Slocum was terrified, but the man just tipped his cap and said these words, telling Slocum that he was a friend. Slocum, in his fevered state, became convinced that this figure was a ghost, specifically the ghost of the pilot from one of Christopher Columbus's ships, the Pinta. And he claimed this spectral pilot took the tiller and expertly guided the spray through the very worst of the gale while he was too sick to move. The ghost even supposedly scolded him for eating plums and cheese together. Now, was it a fever dream, a hallucination? Who knows? But when Slocum finally recovered, the storm had passed and the spray was still sailing perfectly on course. So he survived his own mind, he survived a phantom-guided storm. But the next set of challenges were much more real, much more tangible. Now he had to face the dangers posed by other people in some of the most remote and dangerous waters in the world. He was up against two very different but equally lethal human threats. First, near Gibraltar, he was chased by actual pirates, armed men in a fast boat who wanted to rob him and most likely kill him. And then later, way down in the treacherous channels of the Strait of Magellan, he had to deal with the local Fuegians, who had a fierce reputation for attacking any ship that tried to pass through their waters. His run-in with the pirates was like something out of a movie. Their boat, a felucca, was way faster than the spray, and they were gaining on him fast. Slocum said he could see the looks on their faces, the excitement as they got ready to board him. It was over. And then, out of a clear sky, a violent squall hit. The pirates had way too much sail up for the sudden wind. Their boat was thrown into chaos, and Slocum was saved at the absolute last second. Another miracle? Maybe.
Okay, now for the Fuegians, his solution was just brilliant. Before he entered the strait, another ship captain heard Slocum was going through alone and gave him this weird gift, a big bag of ordinary carpet tacks. Slocum had no idea what to do with them, but the captain just told him, "You'll need these. Just be careful you don't step on them yourself."
And here's the genius plan he came up with. Every single night, before he went to sleep, he'd go out on deck and scatter these tacks everywhere, sharp side up. Then he'd go down into his cabin and wait. And sure enough, under the cover of darkness, canoes would glide silently up to the spray, their occupants ready to climb aboard for a surprise attack. And the result was exactly what you'd expect. These guys, barefoot, would leap onto the deck and land on dozens of sharp tacks. Slocum wrote that the dead silence of the night would just be shattered by these sudden yelps and howls of pain as the attackers scrambled back into their canoes. It was a simple, non-lethal, and an absolutely brilliant defense. After surviving the Strait of Magellan, Slocum crossed the Pacific, then the Indian Ocean. It was an incredibly long and lonely stretch. And that brings us to the final part of his journey, the long, long way home, and the beginning of his legend. This right here, this table reveals the spray's secret weapon. This is the single biggest reason the entire voyage was even possible. The boat was so perfectly designed and balanced that she could steer herself. I mean, just look at these numbers. On one leg of the journey, 2,700 miles that took 23 days, Slocum only had to physically touch the tiller for about 1 hour total. He could just tie the wheel in place, and the little sloop would hold its course through wind and waves day and night. It's an almost unbelievable feat of naval architecture, and it's what let him sleep and eat and survive. 46,000 miles. Let that number just sink in for a minute. That is almost enough to go round the Earth twice. And it was all done in a tiny wooden boat by one man with nothing but a compass, a sextant, and his own incredible skill. And so, after 3 years, 2 months, and 2 days at sea, the little boat that the locals said would only crawl sailed quietly back into the harbor at Fairhaven. The impossible journey was done. Joshua Slocum had actually done it. He had sailed alone around the entire world. In the end, when people called him lucky, Slocum wanted to make one thing really clear. His success wasn't about luck. As he says right here, it was about deeply understanding the work and being prepared for anything. His decades of studying the sea, his skill in rebuilding the boat from a wreck, his careful planning, that's what brought him home. He was ready for every emergency because he was a true master of his craft. And that's what Slocum's journey really leaves us with, right? This massive question. His voyage was never just about sailing. It was this incredible testament to human resilience, to ingenuity, and to the immense courage it takes to face not just all the dangers of the world, but also that vast empty ocean inside yourself.